Welcome to the second module of my talk on the maritime domain and on trying to understand the maritime domain through a navigation of certain cardinal concepts. We've already looked at two cardinal concepts, the notion of the global commons and the notion of public goods. What we are now going to explore is the idea of sovereign territoriality. And for this, we need to understand a particular moment in early modern European history. This backdrop you have behind me is of a very important, captures a very important moment. It's a painting by Gerard ter Bosch. It's called The Ratification of the Treaty of Münster. It was painted in 1648, which was when, in fact, the Treaty of Münster itself was signed. And we need to understand the significance of this. What is the significance? Basically, there were these three peace treaties signed between May and October of 1648 in the towns of Osnabrück and Münster. Together, they are called the Peace of Westphalia. And what they did was first, they ended the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire from 1618 to 1648, and also ended the 80 Years' War from 1568 to 1648 between Spain and the Dutch Republic. So that's interesting. But why should it concern us? It concerns us because of the consequences. The Peace of Westphalia created a new form of political organization. This form of political organization is what is called the sovereign state system, sovereign territorial state. That's what's really important to understand. The historical consequences of the Peace of Westphalia was to create a new form of political organization. It's a system which is not just sovereign, it is territorial. As the diplomatic historian Paul Kennedy has said very famously, the Peace of Westphalia ensured that the Europe of 1600 would consist of many nations and not one hegemony. That's the point. So there was no longer one single power dominating all of Europe. There were multiple powers that all had control over a particular piece of land and had to then work their relationships, their mutual relationships with each other. So internally, what sovereign power implies is complete and unrestricted jurisdiction over a particular territory and population. That's the internal consequence of sovereign power. Externally, what it implies is mutual recognition by states of one another's complete and unrestricted power over a particular territory and population. So the consequences are that there is no authority over and above the sovereign state. There is no such thing as world government in international politics, right? All states are juridically equal and functionally similar. In law, in international law, all states have exactly the same status. And also, they're functionally similar. If you wish to be a state, you must perform all the functions associated with sovereign statehood. Otherwise, you cease to be a state. You begin to be called a failed state or a failing state, right? And the only way, therefore, that you can differentiate between different states is on the basis of their relative capabilities, namely, about how powerful state A is vis a vis state B. Otherwise, state A and state B have the same legal status, juridical status, and they both have the same set of functions to perform. So the Westphalian system then is a state system. It's a system consisting solely in that sense of states and their mutual interaction. Today, we are very accustomed to talk of non state actors, but we need to understand that these non state actors still function in a system consisting of sovereign territorial states. Sovereign territoriality itself has still not been challenged. There is no authority over and above the sovereign state. And this system, the sovereign state system, then gives each state enormous power, but also huge vulnerabilities. A sovereign state has only itself to be responsible to, but therefore it has only itself to fall back on, only itself to rely on. Every state must guarantee, this is a direct implication of what I have just said, every state must guarantee its own security. That becomes, in fact, its primary responsibility. A state may choose to do this by forming alliances with other states, but that also is its sovereign right. It's a decision that a state has to take, whether it wishes to protect itself by building its own power or whether it wishes to join in alliance with other states. That's entirely a sovereign decision of each state. The Westphalian system, therefore, also, please understand the implications, is a war system. And it's a system, therefore, in which the war, the possibility of war, is always there because you have different political units, different political authorities, all of whom have exclusive and claim exclusive jurisdiction over a particular territory and population. That mutual recognition becomes very important. I, as a sovereign state, will tell you, as a sovereign state, this is the point at which I recognize my power ending and your power beginning. So borders become very important. Borders delimit the exercise of political authority. And so, where borders are disputed, wars happen. And this was not so in earlier periods of history. That's very important for us to remember. In earlier periods of history, we had frontiers, not borders. Now we have borders. And that's why we have disputes over borders, because the core principle, the organizing principle of international political life itself is the notion of exclusive jurisdiction. Now, one of the implications of this is that as technology opens up new spaces, states try to control the new forms of territory that emerge. So, as and when a new space emerges thanks to technology, you find a new form of territory emerging. And I think the best analogy to understand what I have just said is going back to the early 20th century. Throughout human history, the skies above, they were always considered as the zone of freedom, right? This was the abode of divinity, free as a bird. This term, free as a bird, it exists in about 85 different languages because the birds were seen by human beings to be free because they could fly, whereas human beings couldn't fly, right? And in fact, there were some very important movies that were made, those magnificent men in their flying machines, which was just celebrating the power of flight itself. And very soon after that, however, came the First World War. And in the First World War, suddenly, states realized, the warring powers realized, that they actually had taken warfare to another dimension, the aerial dimension. So, this notion that somehow you can have a space that the state will not seek to occupy is, I think, a notion that we need to be very suspicious of. As heavier than air machines took flight, states asserted their sovereignty over the air columns above their terrestrial and maritime territories, and the concept of airspace was born. So, only when human beings could actually get into that space that it becomes a territory. And what was the logic of airspace? The logic pertained to state security. The point was, once human beings could go into the air columns above Earth, you had to keep those air columns secure because otherwise a hostile power could come over your air column and throw a weapon, a bomb, or whatever it may be on you. So you had to make sure that nobody could be on the air columns over your territory. That's what I mean when I say space gets territorialized. Space gets securitized. Space gets militarized. Space gets weaponized. And all of these are consequences ultimately of state security, keeping yourself safe because we live in a sovereign territorial system. And the analogy with airspace was actually directly with the territorial sea in international maritime law. Now, in international maritime law, we have a notion of the territorial sea, which is 12 nautical miles. 12 nautical miles from where the shoreline ends. Why? Because that was seen to be the extreme range of cannon. So you had to make sure that all warships were 12 nautical miles away from you. So by law, 12 nautical miles below the shore is your territory as much as land is to keep yourself safe. And then a further 12 nautical miles beyond that are what is called the contiguous zone. And the contiguous zone, again, is where states have police rights. So your Coast Guard can go out there, have sanitation rights. You can take vessels that have, say, any kind of a outbreak of on it. You can put them beyond your contiguous zone to make sure that you're not infected, that they do not carry germs with them. And then beyond that, you have the high seas. I'll talk about that a little later. And when it comes to space, we've just seen in the last module how outer space is seen as a global commons. And there are treaties with regards to the military use of space. Outer space so far has been militarized only up to the limited extent of having spy satellites in space. So you basically outer space is used essentially to do what? To observe potential enemies, potential rivals, potential competitors, right? But there's always a possibility of space being militarized and weaponized beyond the spy satellite itself. And that has happened in the past. There was during the Reagan administration in the United States, there was what was called the Star Wars Initiative, which was basically creating a strategic defense initiative whereby you could put weapons in space to knock down enemy ballistic missiles. Today, there is the notion of ballistic missile defense. So the idea is even areas of the global commons, areas that are currently governed by international law, potentially can be militarized. And this is true also, by the way, of the internet. In the year 2015, there were 3.2 billion users of the internet, amounting to slightly over 40% of the world's population. Since then, the figures have increased even more. And we see exactly the same analogy working itself out with the internet as well. In its early years, the internet was seen largely in terms of the global commons. This has turned out to be an illusion. Initially, the internet was seen in terms of anarchy, the anarchy of the internet. Now it turns out to be an illusion. And why is it an illusion? It is because internet creates a new type of space. That's what the internet has done. Internet has created something called cyberspace. And this space now is being regarded increasingly by states as a new form of territory. So you see territorialization taking place even of cyberspace. As states, societies, and economies become ever more dependent upon information technology, cyberspace will inevitably become a theater of war. It's in the very nature of space and the way states seek to control space. And that goes back to the notion of sovereign territoriality that I had mentioned. In fact, UNIDIR, which is the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, that had, in a very important study in 2013, it had noted that more than 40 states have developed some military cyber capabilities. And at least 12 states have developed some capabilities to conduct offensive cyber warfare. This was a study of 2013 by a very respected institution of the United Nations system. And by the way, these numbers that I've just talked about, 40 states with some military cyber capabilities and 12 states with offensive cyber warfare capabilities, these are self declared capabilities. This is states themselves saying that they have these capabilities officially. In the next module, we will further explore the fourth of the cardinal concepts that will help us understand what the maritime domain is. And that is the notion of space and place. And having done that, we will then proceed to look at the maritime domain and understand it anew.